Welcome, everyone. My name is Stijn Van Nieuwerburgh. I'm the Earle Kazis and Benjamin Schore Professor of Real Estate here at Columbia Business School and the co-director of the Paul Milstein Center of Real Estate. It's a privilege to moderate this timely conversation on real estate challenges posed by climate change with a focus on New York City. And I'm actually joined by two of the nation's most visionary leaders at that intersection of climate, urban policy, and real estate, Jonathan Rose and Dr. Rohit Aggarwala, whose work defines what it means to build cities that not only endure, but flourish in the face of climate change. So let me introduce them to you briefly. So Jonathan Rose, he's a visionary urban planner, real estate developer, and thought leader dedicated to creating environmentally, socially, and economically resilient cities. As the founder and president of Jonathan Rose Companies, established in 1989, he has led the development of sustainable, affordable, and mixed-income communities across the United States. His firm is recognized for its innovative approach to integrating housing, community development, and environmental stewardship. Beyond his professional achievements, Jonathan co-founded the Garrison Institute with his wife, Diana, and also authored the acclaimed book, The Well-Tempered City, which proposes that by aligning our cities with the rhythms of nature and human dignity, we can build a better future. Rohit Aggarwala is a pioneering force in urban sustainability and climate leadership. As New York City's Chief Climate Officer and Commissioner of the Department of Environmental Protection, Dr. Aggarwala is at the forefront of efforts to make our city more resilient and environmentally just. His career spans transformative roles, including founding the Mayor's Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability under Mayor Bloomberg, leading the development of PLA NYC, and shaping global urban policy through his work at the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group and Sidewalk Labs. Rohit is a Columbia alumnus and an adjunct professor at our school, at SIPA, our School for International and Public Affairs. Thank you both for being here, and please join me in welcoming our two speakers. So in our first talk this morning, we saw some of the statistics on climate change. I won't repeat them. I will just say that those apply to New York City as well. Coastal cities have been suffering from rising sea level changes, rising temperatures, the health risks associated with pollution. And it's clear that real estate is at the forefront of these changes, especially in places like New York City. It's climate change is redrawing our flood maps, it's stressing our grid, it's changing valuations, it's introducing new underwriting challenges for real estate. So Rohit, I wanted to start with you and ask you how New York City is responding to that changing environment and improving urban resiliency. What have we done so far? What are some of the challenges going forward for New York City?
Well, thank you, and it's always great to be back at my alma mater at Columbia Business School. New York City has been working on climate change, both on the mitigation and resilience side, since about 2006, when Mayor Bloomberg first undertook this. Most notably, I'd say the biggest thing we are doing on the mitigation side is the well-known Local Law 97, which is a mandatory effort to force large buildings to reduce their carbon emissions through energy efficiency and electrification. Of course, we've got a lot of work going on the transportation side, both on vehicle electrification and, of course, on the shift to transit and non-polluting modes like bikes and pedestrianization. On the adaptation side, we are dealing with the three main risks we face. One is, as you pointed out, we're a coastal city. We have 520 miles of coastline in New York City. We fail often to realize that we are every bit the island archipelago as like the Maldives. And that requires what we think is probably something on the order of $50 billion worth of coastal infrastructure that we're going to have to build over the next 25 to 50 years. We've seen over the last several years a dramatic increase in severe storm events, most notably Hurricane Irene in 2021, which killed 13 New Yorkers, most of whom horrifically drowning in their basement apartments due to flooding. And one of the things that we've seen particularly in my role as commissioner of the water utility, 4 of the 5 most intense rainstorms in New York City's history have taken place in the last 4 years. So it is a dramatic change, and we'll see. Maybe it's a blip and there's a reversion to the mean, but it would be consistent with the climate models to think. that the trend has actually changed. And so we have begun in earnest to plan for true stormwater resilience, which itself is also a massive set of investments. Our back of the envelope estimate right now is about $30 billion to bring a basic level of stormwater resilience so that our stormwater management system inland can keep pace with the increase in the frequency and severity of intense storms. And then the final one is heat. And while flooding gets the most attention because it's the most dramatic, it's the most visual, the reality is that while roughly 50 New Yorkers have died between Hurricane Sandy and Hurricane Irene due to climate change-related flooding over the last decade or so, we estimate, or the New York City Department of Health estimates, about 500 New Yorkers have died because of the increase in heat in the summers that we've had over the last decade. And while we've done work on cooling and thinking about tree canopy, we're in the process of developing an urban forestry strategy. And of course, starting in the Bloomberg administration, we planted 1 million trees across New York City. The reality is we have shifted to a public health intervention approach, which is, frankly, we are moving to require air conditioning in residential units. It's a very small percentage of residential units in New York City that don't have air conditioning, but the reality is all 500 of those deaths have been a very similar profile. People over the age of 65, people who have a pre-existing condition, people who live alone because you don't die of heat exhaustion if somebody is there to notice that you are beginning to suffer. And 100% of them did not have a functioning air conditioner at home. And so just as we have a mandatory minimum temperature for living spaces, we are working with the City Council to move towards a maximum temperature for indoor living spaces as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for giving us such a nice overview of all these different resiliency efforts. Jonathan, I want to turn to you. You've been a pioneer in developing climate resilient buildings, affordable housing buildings notably, for a very long time, long before that became mainstream in real estate development. So I wanted to ask you, how did your development practices change over the years as you saw the risks of climate change rise, and how do you envision them changing in the future?
Thank you. So first of all, I want to note that the scale that Radley just spoke to us about is bigger than we currently have the economic system to address. So because we're building affordable housing, our buildings are all subsidized, so we're making the most climate resilient and least climate impacting buildings we can, but we can only do that within the existing financing structures, and the existing financing structures are not taking into account the timescales. So just a little framework. So Rich spoke about $50 billion of sea level rise mitigation and $30 billion of stormwater mitigation. And my guess is that'll last 30 years, 40 years, 50 years maybe, or something like that. No.
2100, hopefully.
Yeah, well, and then we're gonna have to do it again. Mm-hmm. So number one, we're hugely dependent upon the public making these investments. They have to continue to make these because the individual buildings cannot in themselves. We just completed the largest passive house affordable housing project in the world, and we're seeing this technology. So passive house is a system where you super insulate the building. It actually not only makes it need less energy to heat, but it actually needs less energy to cool. It's using more natural systems. It's using And so it's a very good system. So we're seeing that. So 20 years ago, if we proposed passive house, the funding agencies would have said this is a waste of money. And today, passive house is more and more becoming a standard. It's not a standard yet, but we're moving towards that. And I think that's a really good thing. So number one, most important is to think about our buildings' skins, how well insulated and how climate resilient they are. And then number two, what energy systems we're using. And so we are building all electric now because if the electrons are green, then the building is fossil fuel free. And we're seeing that as a technology rising more and more too. The third issue is, so from a operating point of view, we're not there, but both we as a company and as a industry, we're getting better. The third issue, though, that we really have to address is the embodied carbon in the materials of the building that we're building themselves. And the biggest advance in the industry globally is the use of what I call biologically based materials, such as mass timber. And New York City only allows one to build 5 or 6 stories tall with mass timber. Many other cities around the world allow us to build taller. That would be really the next step from the regulatory side that it could unleash a much more climate beneficial construction industry.
Great, thank you. So we talked a bit about development of new buildings, but of course, the buildings that will be here in 2050, for the most part, have already been built.
Right.
And so the question then becomes, how do we adapt the existing infrastructure, the existing built environment? So how do we bring more climate resilience in the existing stock of housing? This is a question sort of for both of you.
So this is something we're very active in. We actually have a whole series of private equity funds that buy existing affordable housing, preserve it as affordable, make it greener. It's much harder because, number one, let's go back to what I described before. The facade in many ways is a big part of climate resilience. And it's very hard to redo the facade of an older building and not typically cost effective. We can convert the systems. There's no economic payback in decarbonization. In many parts of the country, in fact, the cost of electricity is more expensive per BTU than natural gas, so you're actually going backwards economically by decarbonizing. And that's where the IRA has been so helpful for affordable housing. We hope those programs are in question right now. We hope they stick. So again, we're going to need as a society to make it more economically viable for us to decarbonize existing buildings. The third lever, though, which is really important, is human behavior, too. It's not going to completely solve our issues, but we can cut our carbon impacts, our climate impacts by 5 to 15% just by being more careful about how we consume things.
Go ahead.
Well, I'll say, I mean, Jonathan mostly spoke about decarbonization. To think specifically about resilience, one of the things that we've been facing is the reality that, just frankly, New Yorkers expect the city government to take care of a lot of their problems, right? And one of the things that we've had to shift to remind people about is that there is a shared responsibility here. It is going to take us a long time to re-engineer New York City's infrastructure to address climate change. And in the interim, building owners and homeowners need to be ready to protect themselves. Large, sophisticated property owners, particularly in the denser parts of the city, will be able to figure that out, and Jonathan and his peers are certainly doing that. We've spent more of our time trying to educate the homeowners in the lower density parts of the city who are, in general, far less sophisticated. One of the things that I think relatively few New Yorkers fully appreciate is the extent to which there's a lot of low income and minority wealth creation that goes on in the lower density parts of the outer boroughs, where you have a lot of minority and low income home ownership. And we really have to help those owners preserve their capital and preserve that equity. They are in many cases on the front lines of flooding, and yet they don't know how to protect their property. New York, unlike Florida or the Midwest, where they have a long tradition of having to deal with tornadoes, or the West Coast, where they have a long tradition of thinking about earthquakes, the reality is that for roughly 400 years of our history, New Yorkers' main weather-related threats have been blizzards. We know how to deal with snowstorms, and this is a different level of threat because snowstorms can kill you if you get caught in it or if you slip and fall, but they don't tend to destroy property the way flooding does. And one of the things that I have seen quite clearly, and I make a pitch to all of the aspiring entrepreneurs out there, there is a massive set of opportunities to help small property owners achieve resilience at scale, right? We do not have the sun runs and solar cities of the resilience side of the equation. And what I see over and over again is a lot of these property owners are getting bad advice because think about this, there's a total mismatch in the market. if you own a brownstone or a single family home in Canarsie or someplace, and you need to manage flooding on your property, you're most likely to call a plumber. If you're a plumber in New York City, what do you know how to do? You know how to install a shower or a kitchen, right? You do not actually know how to do drainage plans. And so I've done countless of these walking tours with electeds and Congress members and whatever, right, to go visit their constituents who have had flooding. And we'll walk into a basement and they'll say, this has got to be the city's fault. Something's wrong with the sewer system because I put in a sump pump and my basement still floods. And one of our engineers will look at them and say, what the hell is the sump pump doing over there? It should be over here. They say, well, the plumber told me to put it over here. And it's like, well, you got really bad advice because there's a whole world of people who don't yet know what they're doing. And just as we've spent 50 years since the energy crisis that Emmanuel talked about, with various utility programs trying to get the world of electricians and homeowners and renovators to figure out how to make buildings and homes more energy efficient, we're going to have to start making that industry-wide transition when it comes to particularly flood management.
I wanted to pick up on one thing you mentioned about Local Law 97, right? So yesterday actually was the filing deadline for the first full year where Local Law 97 was in force, which was 2024. And we heard reports of certain properties where the owners, these were typically maybe co-ops, maybe lower income co-ops, were struggling to meet these requirements, and it sort of creates this paradox that it's often the most vulnerable communities with the fewest resources that are now facing these costs of basically adhering to the law. So how do we think about this? And what do we do about it?
Well, look, I think one of the other things that, and I think it's consistent with both what Radley and Emmanuel said earlier, we have very much shifted. In the teens, we did a lot of big, ambitious policy commitments like Local Law 97, like the New York State Climate Leadership Act. Now we've spent years trying to figure out how to deliver this, right? And delivery is hard because, as you point out, we've got, again, sophisticated property owners in New York City are going to figure this out. They have the consultants, they have the accountants. They'll make a rational determination to do this or pay a fine or what have you. I have this all the time where I talk to people in a co-op and it turns out they don't even have a property manager because they fired the property manager 10 years ago to save on management fees, and the super fills out all the forms, right? And they get all of their energy efficiency advice from their boiler guy. And so that's the level of sophistication, and we've got thousands and thousands of buildings where we've got to help people get up to speed with what is a relatively sophisticated challenge. Now, we've done a number of things. First, when it comes to low and moderate income co-ops, that has actually been the loudest voice complaining about Local Law 97. What very few of them appreciate is that is the one area where the city has actually moved to be very generous. So we enacted a J51 tax credit where these low and moderate income or value co-ops, which basically is anything out of Manhattan south of 96th Street and Brownstone, Brooklyn, would qualify for this. They can get 80% of the cost of compliance returned to them through a property tax credit. Now, they have to get the financing because the property tax credit will get paid back over 15 years, but it is there. The barrier is not so much the funding and the costs. The barrier is the sophistication to figure out what to do, how to do it efficiently. We do see a problem, and it's a problem that city government is frankly ill-equipped to advise on because we can't give advice on specific technologies or specific providers. But there are some really, really good providers out there offering really good advice and really efficient solutions. And then there are some not so good providers out there who are going to give bad advice and overcharge. And I think one of our biggest challenges is how do we, at scale, get that good advice into the market? We do have a concierge program called the New York City Accelerator. We're in the process actually of updating that so that it provides far more sophisticated advice than it's done in the past. But I think this is very much, and thinking about Emmanuel's point about a pragmatic phase, we're going to have to be really pragmatic because this is about delivery and execution. It is not about goal setting and policy commitment.
So sort of the broader topic here is this alignment of public and private sector. And so Jonathan, I wanted to ask you, what do you see as sort of some of the gaps there? Like to what extent could there be better alignment maybe in the area of financing and rewarding investment in resilient real estate?
So first of all, I really appreciate the requirement of investment in resilience, because if we didn't, well, there's two sides to this. There's the mitigation, the reducing of one's impact, which is essential. And then the second is making oneself more resilient. I just want to get into those a little bit more, because I do believe every one of us has a moral responsibility to try and reduce or eliminate our impacts. And as I said, those are typically not cost effective to the individual, because you're asking an individual to take on a societal and a global ecological issue. The bridge to that has to be lower cost financing or credits or something that reimburses the individual for taking on a societal role. And then the second side is resilience, and is Radley described in that it's not only an issue about sea level rise, is an issue of heat. Britt was talking about heat. There's a series, by the way, we're going to see potentially food supply issues, et cetera. There's a whole set of interdependent issues. The best thing we can do for those is, I want to reinforce what Britt said, is get the right information out, because there are adaptive strategies, and we're seeing their diffusion lower. And by the way, the right adaptive strategies will create tons of what I call guys for jobs with trucks. The plumber you're talking about, the small business, it's an incredible job creation and economic development opportunity. But we have to scale the knowledge, and then we need really, really low cost financing. And we need something which the real estate major lenders have been resisting. We need a much bigger system of PACE lending, or something that goes prime to the mortgage, 2% or 3% interest loans that can pay for these improvements.
Great. I want to turn our conversation a little bit towards the pricing of climate risk, because there's in my mind, real estate is the asset, right, where that price of climate risk becomes visible, maybe the earliest, right, or one of the earliest, right? Now, it's interesting, the early climate finance academic literature is actually all over the place and often doesn't find any pricing of climate risk for, let's say, coastal residential properties. And sort of interestingly, only the places where people believe in climate changes is where the price of the housing actually reflects climate concerns. So I was going to ask you, do you see that change? Do you see prices of real estate actually reflect that climate risk? And in what type of real estate do we see this?
So I actually think the real estate market is nuts, because look at the South Coast. You look at the coastal areas of Florida, Texas, where there's enormous climate risk. By the way, when you have cities where there are more than 100 days a year that have temperature over 100 degrees, and I think over 50 days in which it's over 110 degrees. These are unlivable cities, or they're going to become unlivable cities, and yet their values keep going up. So I think the market is incredibly near-term in general, and it's thinking, we as a company think a tremendous amount about climate risk. So we look at location with sea level rise, location. The other indicator, which is the cost of insurance. We're going to have a panel later today on the cost of insurance. And the insurance rates have been dramatically rising. And so we have two problems. You can design a very climate resilient building, and you can put it in a climate resilient location, but when the insurance market overall has $100 billion of US losses, somehow those have to get paid for. So even the best performers are going to have an increase in insurance. We model this. So first of all, we're in the market for continually buying affordable housing. And we are often competing against people who are not modeling insurance risk the way we are, and therefore we lose. So we're very aware that the rest of the market is not paying enough attention, we think, to insurance. And even the way we're modeling it is just a guess. And my instinct is we're going to be reaching a point in which the climate risks are going to become uninsurable.
Yeah, of course. I mean, if that happens, it's often a requirement to get a mortgage to have insurance, right? And without a mortgage, what is the value of a property? So there's sort of this risk of a market breakdown, and especially in some of these coastal cities in Florida, for example.
So it's not only a real estate risk, every business needs insurance. And my sense is that's going to be the wake-up call. So when Emmanuel said we've reached a pragmatic phase, the pragmaticism is ignoring the larger existential issues. And my sense, and I'm surprised that the insurance industry is not more active in Washington today saying, hey, we know you guys have a political philosophy, but it's ignoring the insurance tsunami that's coming. My sense is when it really, really hits hard. So just to give you an example, it's almost impossible to insure a house now in the state of Iowa because of the hailstorms and the tornadoes. As that grows, anyway, to me, that's what's going to create the political tipping point that we're going to need.
Rohit, do you have any views on this? For example, I could imagine that at some point, if the insurance market breaks down, the government has to step in and provide that insurance as sort of an insurer of last resort. That is happening in Florida and California to some extent.
Right. Look, I could not agree more with Jonathan. Everything that I see leads me to think that the average person can tell themselves that the next Sandy, the next Irene is a 50-year risk, a 100-year risk. So I'm going to bet that I'll have paid off my mortgage, or I'll be dead, or I'll have sold my home by then. But I do think the insurance crisis is likely to come before the next storm, which, by the way, is good. We'd rather learn our lesson financially than by actually having people die. Whether I don't know. What we've seen in Florida and California is it's the state government, which does have a very different legal and sovereign profile than the city government. So if there's a level of government that has to step in, it's probably the state here in New York as well. But I will point out, and one of the things that I have become so convinced, now I'm in my second stint in city government, everything in New York City is driven by our lack of housing. Right? And fundamentally, the reason that there is basically no climate risk that's factored into our housing market is that in a city with a 1% vacancy rate, nobody gets to choose where they actually live, right? With the exception of the most elite multi-millionaires buying $10 and $20 million properties, right? Everybody else gets to see, like, where do I need to live for my family or my commute? How big a home or an apartment do I need to accommodate my family? And what can I possibly afford? And at that point, you're done making your choices. And so you basically have to accept risk in the same way that you have to accept a longer commute, or you have to accept a less attractive home than you might otherwise. And that's, I think, one of the realities of New York City. And I think it's true also on the developer side, because there are so few properties that developers, I think, are willing to take more risk than they rationally might, in the bet that, well, hopefully I'm out by the time it comes back to haunt me.
So two things about this. We deeply believe that there's going to be a green premium. Even though America is slowing down in its climate commitments, there's a global financial system, the insurance companies, the reinsurers, and the major financial institutions are all investors. And our sense is, whether it's in Europe, where they're going to be required to have greener portfolios, there's going to be a demand for, or just the resilience of them. Our view is that 10 years from now, the investing market is going to distinguish between green and brown portfolios. We can't price that in now, but we actually think there'll be a green premium. That's number one. Number two, on the insurance side, what we're seeing in California and Florida is that the government is taking over the risk. And in many ways, that's a hidden tax increase, and it's unsustainable. At any rate, so I have an alternative suggestion. I happen to love the idea of mutual insurance companies. And in a mutual insurance company, it's owned by the shareholders themselves. And typically what mutual insurance companies have done is paid a dividend back when they've had profit. My view is, what if a mutual insurance company didn't pay an economic dividend back? Instead, they paid an information dividend back, basically helping cover that that information gap that you were describing. Your insurance company was actually the one that gave you guidance on how to be more resilient. And then they gave you the low-cost financing to achieve it. And presuming you took the advice and the financing, your insurance rates would be lower. And that would, because what we need to do is create virtuous circles that connect information, finance, technology, and that might help advance that.
Great. We are out of time, but I wanted to thank both of you for for your leadership over the decades, climate leadership in New York City, for all the wonderful ideas that you shared with us today, and best of luck to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.